Well, welcome to another episode of the Residential Developer Podcast. I'm the host, Nathan Battershaw, and I come with really exciting news today to share within this podcast. Last month, you would have seen that I spoke about the pending reforms of the low and mid-rise housing policy that was due to come into effect. Well, as of the 28th of February, this policy is now in effect, the Stage 2 reforms. The non-discretionary standards of the policy have now come into effect for low and mid-rise housing. So it's been something I've been obviously talking a lot about on this podcast. It's been something that's been in the pipeline for over 12 months since it was announced probably 15, 16 months ago. It's been in the planning stages with Planning New South Wales. It's now come into effect as of, I believe, yesterday. It's now written into the SEP, into the State Environmental Planning Policy, the 2021 Housing SEP. I had a good look over the SEP yesterday. It's in effect, so therefore it now is part of the planning policy, and we can now begin to submit applications that fit within that criteria. So I want to spend some time in this episode really educating yourself as investors, developers, builder developers, and mum and dad investors wanting to do projects under this policy. Now, as I spoke about last month, there were some unknowns in terms of the mapping and that side of it. We've now seen the mapping come into effect. There's a spatial planner that's come into effect, so you can actually jump onto that spatial planner. We will put the link to that spatial planner in these show notes so that you can actually access that spatial planner, and you can put in addresses and you can then check and see if they fit within these well-located areas. Now, a couple of things to talk about. So first and foremost, this policy has come into effect for a couple of different criteria. So it's come into effect for dual occupancies, duplexes, attached and detached dual occupancies. It's come into effect for terraces, so 3 or more attached dwellings. It's come into effect for multi-dwelling development and also small unit developments as well. So now you're able to do that within R2, R3, R4 zoning. Obviously, a lot of council areas you were not able to do dual occupancies or multi-dwelling, especially within R2 zoning. Now that's come into effect. A couple of things, though. Originally, a lot of people were of the assumption, and look, it was an unknown because we weren't given any mapping originally. Originally, a lot of people thought that anywhere within essentially Sydney, Hunter, the Hunter, Newcastle area, Central Coast, Illawarra, and Shoalhaven. A lot of people originally thought that anywhere within any train station within 800 metres you're able to use this policy, and also anywhere within a local centre. We now know from the mapping that there's a lot of areas excluded. Essentially what they've done, obviously, state governments work with local governments to determine housing targets and particular areas that needed to meet those targets. So we're seeing a lot of areas that we thought may have been included in this low and mid-rise housing reform. A lot of areas actually excluded. But the good thing is there's a lot of areas that are included, but it's important to know there are a lot of areas excluded too, and you can actually go on to this map that we'll share in the show notes. You'll be able to go on and just see if there's an area you've got a property or an area where you're looking at. You'll be able to really get a good idea of what areas fall under this reform. So not every area that's within 800 metres of a train station has been included, and not every area located within 800 metres of a local centre or a CBD has been included. So already I know there's quite a fefew people disappointed that own properties within some of those areas that were hoping and waiting for this reform to come out. But there's also a lot of obviously a lot of people that do own properties within that area who have been able to establish a winner out of this. And already I'm seeing a bit of a shift in the market. Like I've had a couple of clients only in the last week since the reform came out where they were looking at a site like Northern Beaches, for example. There's some really terrific areas within the Northern Beaches now where you've not even been able to do dual occupancies in the past. Now you can do multi-dwelling, you can do dual occupancies, and we're seeing sites literally going on the market and gone within a day. So we're seeing almost like a couple of years ago where literally properties were selling within the day and it was very competitive. So in a way that's exciting for the market. I think it'll boost things up a little bit. Obviously we've had that interest rate drop. So there are some good signs and some really exciting things that have happened as a result. But look, one thing to note about this mapping, the information I've been given around this mapping is that just because you're within that mapped area, you still need to prove. So when you submit your application, when you submit your DA, say, for example, you want to do a dual occupancy in a particular area, let's just say it's somewhere in the Sutherland Shire, and you want to submit a DA, let's just say you fit within that mapped area, you still need to show, and this is something that it's a little bit unclear on, but you still need to show that you are within 800 metres distance. You can't just be radius. You have to show that you are an 800-metre distance to either that train station or to that local centre that's been deemed in that code. That's the information I've been given. And if that changes, I'm happy to jump back on the podcast to clarify that further. But all the research and the information I've been given to date is that you need to make sure that you are still within 800 metres. Just because you fall within that mapping, you need to show that you are that distance. So it's going to be very interesting. There's still some unknowns. And obviously I like to be someone who always has contingency. But for people who are looking at acquisition, just be very careful, because I think you still need to show council when you're doing that application that you are within that distance of that station. So I think it's going to be quite contentious, especially if you're 850 or 790 or 760. It's a bit of a watch this space for me in terms of how that's going to roll out, how that's going to play out, how that's going to be interpreted by local governments, because it's a very interesting space to be in. But look, this particular code, it's obviously applicable to a few key areas, and I know I spoke about this last month a little bit in the episode, but the main areas this code has come into effect is obviously across Sydney, certain areas within train stations and local centres across Sydney. Again, jump on the map, you'll be able to see. It's also across areas of the Illawarra, the Shoalhaven to the south coast, in the south coast area, more so around especially Bomaderry. It also goes into areas of the Central Coast. There's still a lot of areas excluded that people thought were going to be included in some of the key suburbs in the Central Coast, and it also goes into some areas of the Hunter. Again, there's a lot of flood-affected areas in parts of Newcastle, so there's a lot of areas that are excluded too in Newcastle. There's obviously quite a lot of flood-affected areas in Newcastle, so we're seeing there's a whole bunch of areas, especially in and around Newcastle, where this low-rise reform really doesn't have any benefit, and it can't be used, especially because of the flood affection, and that goes into other areas too. Some parts of Sydney, also some parts of Wollongong where there's some flood affection. But look, in terms of why they picked those particular areas and why they excluded some of those areas, obviously they've taken into account a whole range of things. There was notification period with all of the councils where they had to make submissions last year, which they obviously did. And there was obviously a backward and forward between state government and local government to determine what areas would be applicable. There were obviously housing targets. Every suburb, every council has different housing targets that are required to be met. So they've taken that into account. Obviously, infrastructure, proximity to working areas where people work, where there's industry, areas where there's public transport, where they need to see growth. So they've taken that into effect. The sole focus, obviously, for this low and mid-rise reform is to deal with a lot of our housing crisis, our shortage of housing to begin to meet targets. Now, there's obviously still unknowns. One thing we're seeing is that local government have at times struggled to keep up with their current workload. So I guess the concern will be is how are they going to cope and manage this increased workload of new areas opened up, new opportunities for multi-dwelling, dual occupancy type developments. And at this stage, a lot of it will have to go through council. There's still a lot of reforms that will limit CDC. We're yet to get a lot of information on that. I'm going to do a separate episode once we get a bit more information around how the reforms and the CDC will work in conjunction when it comes to dual occupancy and terraces. That's another episode in itself, and I'll do that once we get a little bit more clarification from Planning New South Wales and some of the reports I was given that there'll be some updates come July 1 this year. Again, some of the dates that Planning New South Wales had for this particular reform got pushed back. So although July 1 may be the date, it could end up being pushed back as well. It's really hard to tell as to whether they'll make some adaptations to the low-rise diversity housing code, especially around things like the dual occupancy. Under this new reform, it's now allowing a 12-metre frontage width for a duplex within a well-located area or a dual occupancy. Obviously, the low-rise diversity housing code is a 15-metre width at the building line. So that's a big change. So it'll be interesting to see what, if any, adaptations or any changes do get made. I've been getting mixed reports, some saying that it won't change, and then I'm getting some people saying that they believe it will if it is within that well-located area. Again, we'll jump onto another episode to be able to go through that. So under this new reform, there's areas, and I touched on it last episode, but there's some areas that are excluded within this reform. So they're essentially heritage listed sites are excluded from this reform. Land that's got bushfire and flood affection. So that really knocks a lot of areas out. The flood affection, as I mentioned, Newcastle, a lot of areas in Newcastle, especially with flood affection, bushfire affection, areas with high noise. So for example, areas near airports, there's exclusion there. And councils like especially Blue Mountain, Hawkesbury, Wallandilly, there's a lot of these councils that are excluded, especially due to some of the protection areas like bushfire protection. And again, we can put some links up on the show notes so that you can actually see some of those exclusion areas and exclusion reasons why you can't do a development in a well-located area. It could be well-located, but if it has one of these hazards on it, well, it's going to hinder the type of development. But I just want to run through a little bit of a high-level idea around just some of the implementations that have been made to the SEP under this low to mid-rise stage 2 housing reform. So I just want to break it down into categories. So first one we're going to jump into is for dual occupancies for duplexes. So within that well-located area, if it's well-located in that well-located mapped area and it's within that distance to the train station or the local centre, and now the exciting thing is you only require a minimum lot size of 450 square metres. Now, there are a few councils that allow less than 450 square metres, but the exciting thing is most councils don't. So now it's opening up a whole new opportunity for smaller sites, smaller development sites to do dual occupancies, and you also only need a 12-metre frontage. A lot of councils across New South Wales currently sit at around about that 15-metre mark, some less, some are at 14, some don't have a limit, but a lot of them are closer to that 15-metre mark. So 12-metre sites. So again, that's opening up a lot of exciting opportunities, especially in areas close to train stations, in closer to town centres where a lot of the blocks have been carved off and made smaller in the past. So that's going to open up a really great opportunity. And also another exciting thing is the floor space ratio. Floor space ratio is 0.65 to 1, so 65% of the site can be utilised for your floor space ratio. A lot of councils across New South Wales, often in R2, especially low-density residential, tend to be around that 50%, some as low as 45, even 40%. So 65% is terrific because it's going to mean that you can do a decent full-size, often a four-bedroom dwelling either side, single garage, which is exciting. It's going to open up new opportunities. And the height limit's another good one. It's opening up now an opportunity for a 9.5 metre maximum height limit. Again, a lot of councils generally sit around 9 metres, 8.5, some even less. But one of the two common height limits I tend to see across New South Wales generally are around that 8.5 to 9. So it's giving 9.5 opportunities obviously to develop higher ceilings, bring back some more traditional roofs, for especially with the coastal and modern coastal and Hamptons and a lot of the type of design features that people do like these days. But it's an opportunity to open the properties up, make them feel a little bit bigger in that space. And another big one is the car parking spaces. You're only required to have one parking space per dwelling. So essentially that's going to open up a lot of opportunity because a lot of councils, for example, Northern Beaches is a big one. The areas where you have been allowed to do dual occupancy in the past, you generally need the 2 vehicle spaces. A lot of councils have required 2. Now, with this SEP change in this well-located area, you're only required to have 1. And then in terms of the width, you just have to have a minimum width of each dwelling at the building line of 6 metres. Under CDC currently, you need 6.5. You're only required to have the 6 metre width of each. Sorry, that's not of the building, the actual building width. That's the lot width. So essentially, what it means is you can't have, say, for example, an 8 metre one side and then a 4 metre on the other. You need to have 6 on each. So look, that's come into effect. And then in terms of a Torrens title subdivision, then you've just got to make sure the minimum lot size then is 225 square metres, so carving it straight down the middle. The minimum lot size is 225. So some really exciting factors there. And the good thing about, just for those who don't understand how state environmental planning policies work, this new policy, in terms of a hierarchy, will sit above council's local policy. For example, if council have an LEP where the minimum lot size for a dual occupancy is 600 square metres, if this block falls within this, meets this low to mid-rise housing policy in a well-located area that's only 450 square metres, that policy now sits above council's policy. So when it comes to lot size, when it comes to lot width, when it comes to floor space ratio, the height of the building, the parking and the minimum lot size for subdivision, all of those criteria in terms of a hierarchy, they sit above council's policy. So council can't reject a DA now for an application for a dual occupancy based on those particular requirements. Now, a couple of things to mention there, and I'll go into more depth. I'm going to break down in another episode. I'm going to break down dual occupancy and what that means, some of the elements of the code that you still need to comply with. There's a lot of things still not included in the code, in this policy, that you still need to comply with council's development control plan. Things like solar access, private open space, and we'll go more into depth with this, side setbacks, front setbacks, rear setbacks. There's a whole lot of things overshadowing. There's still a lot of the local development controls that you still need to comply with. So it's not every site's going to work under this code. Not every site's going to be applicable, and you still need to get good sound advice, and you still need to make sure your application is prepared. But the reality is council cannot knock an application back on these particular constraints now that sit within the state policy. So just because council might say their floor space ratio might be 50%, they can't knock you back for using 65% because you're complying with that state policy. But they can knock you back on areas of the DCP. So it's still important to put together and piece together a really good application, which we'll break down in another episode. The other exciting change is for multi-dwelling townhouses. So this is an exciting one because prior to this low-rise code being released, there was a lot of councils across New South Wales that have not allowed multi-dwelling in R2 zoned areas, in low-density areas. Now it's opened up an incredible opportunity for doing multi-dwelling in R1, R2, R3 zoned areas. It's exciting, especially in that R2 zoned area. It's opened up avenues now for multi-dwelling. So multi being 3 or more, and it's going to create a new opportunity for investors, developers like yourselves to do small projects or multi-residential developments either on singular blocks or amalgamating some blocks that you otherwise wouldn't have been able to develop. And I always say, like, the early adopters are the ones who do the best in this space, because a lot of agents, because a lot of the community don't understand what can be done or the potential yield that can take place on these sites yet. It's generally the early adopters who will do the best, because you can often get good deals at the moment because people don't understand the potential of what can be done. Like I looked at a site for someone only the other day, and this was being promoted as a dual lock site. Straight away I looked at it. I said, mate, you can do 4 because of the location of this site. It's within a well-located area. In the past, you would have only been able to do a dual lock. This particular council had an 18-metre width that you needed for multi-dwelling. This one was 16. So a lot of people are overlooking the fact you can do multi-dwelling. It met all of the criteria under this new reform. So therefore, they're almost competing in a different game, because they're looking at a site you can now do 4 on. The rest of the market thinks the agent thinks you can only do 2. So it's an exciting space for the early adopter. But a couple of elements of the multi-dwelling. Minimum lot size 600 square metres. Again, a lot of councils, you often need 900, 700, 800. Some councils are 600, but the big one here is the 12-metre frontage width. You're only required to have a 12-metre frontage width for multi-dwelling. Now, again, I'll go into more depth on townhouses in its own separate episode, but keep in mind that width, just be careful, because a 12-metre wide block, it's really difficult to manoeuvre vehicles. So just because it's 12 metres, just be careful in that space. There's a lot of people that will come undone and secure and acquire sites without checking, can you manoeuvre vehicles? How are you going to deal with the overshadowing? As I just mentioned with the dual lock, you've still got to comply with council's DCP for overshadowing, for setbacks, for privacy, private open space. There's a whole range of compliances you still need to meet for the multi-dwelling space. So just because it says you can do multi-dwelling on a block that's 600 square metres, 12-metre frontage, does not mean that it will always work, because of how the site's orientated, the size of the site, all that side of thing. But it does open up new scope and new opportunity for development. So another exciting one is the floor space ratio. It's 0.7 to 1, so 70% of the site can be utilised for this type of development. So, in most councils, that's almost R3 numbers. A lot of councils are 70% for R3 or 80%. In this case, on an R2 site now, you can use 70% of the site, and the big one here is car parking. 1 parking space per dwelling, which is exciting, which means that that's quite often what kills yield on a site is the car parking. Often a lot of development sites, for doing multi-dwelling, you may have to provide double garages, which can really kill and hinder the yield. So it's an opportunity to increase housing volume in these well-located areas, and that's why they brought this code into effect. Is not to create shoeboxes, but to create housing and volume of housing in areas that are deemed to be well located, accessible to traffic, accessible to shops, accessible to infrastructure. And that's the exciting thing about it. So they're deeming that a lot of people in this space will possibly be a one car family, or could be someone who possibly is relying on public transport, all that side of things. So height limit, same as dual lock, 9.5 metres. In R2, this is a good outcome. Well and truly gives you the opportunity to do a good size 2-story dwelling, possibly even higher ceilings than usual, and still do a nice roof line, not having to have your typical flat roof to keep under the height limit. Again, you've still got to comply with overshadowing, privacy. There's still a lot of elements you still need to take into account. So just because you've got a 9.5 height limit, especially on a 12-metre block, does not necessarily mean that it's going to be acceptable. You still need to piece together and put together a suitable application. Terraces is another element under this reform. So terraces are essentially 3 or more dwellings that all address the street. A lot of people, when they see terraces, they think the old Paddington style or Balmain style terraces. Terraces, in a sense, are a bit like a multi-dwelling. The difference is multi-dwellings sometimes can be front to back, where you drive into the site, have a series of townhouses or multi-dwelling units. Terraces all address the street, so they're very common on very shallow blocks or very wide blocks, or often corner blocks, or a combination of a corner block and a block next door amalgamated, often make good terraces. So under this reform, terraces are going to be possible and permissible, bringing the lot size down to 500 square metres. But the main difference is you need an 18-metre frontage. Now, under CDC, currently you need a 21-metre frontage. For terraces, under this new reform, the minimum lot size is 500 square metres and 18-metre frontage. Again, I'm going to do a separate episode specifically for CDC. This is, at the moment, is all geared around DA, lodging a DA for dual occupancy, multi-dwelling, terrace houses or residential flat buildings. And same as multi-dwelling, floor space ratio, 70%. Height limit, exactly the same as the multi-dwelling, is 9.5. And the parking's an interesting one. It's 0.5 spaces per dwelling. So that's a very interesting one. So what they're essentially saying is you only have to provide a parking space for every second terrace. I'm not saying you should do that, but obviously they're deeming that terraces are the type of developments they do want to see right into some of those well-located areas, possibly near train stations and areas where people may be more relying on public transport. So there's obviously going to be some advantages to create some really good creative terrace housing developments within some of these well-located areas. Again, the same as multi-dwelling, it's applicable in R1, R2, R3 zone, and a couple of things here. The minimum lot size is 165 square metres per lot, with 6 metres of width per site for the terraces. And then lastly, the residential flat buildings. This low to mid-rise reform has now opened up opportunity in these well-located areas to do residential flat buildings. Now, a couple of things around the flat buildings. Minimum lot size is 500 square metres and 12-metre frontage. It's applicable in R1, R2 zones at 80% with a 9.5 height limit. Okay, so if it's in an R1 or an R2 zoning, so general residential, low-density residential, it's giving an opportunity for an 80%, 0.8 to 1 floor space ratio, which is bigger, obviously more than the terrace and the multi-dwelling. And the same height limit, 9.5 height limit. So essentially means that a lot of people were worried about being able to do large, high-rise buildings within the low-density residential areas. I know a lot of people that own houses, low-density houses within these well-located areas were really nervous and worried about people being able to do 4-story or 6-story dwellings within that space. That's not the case. So if it's R1, R2, 9.5 height limit, so essentially 2 stories. And then if it's R3 and R4 zone, so medium and high density residential, but the difference is it's got to be within 400 meters of a center. Okay, there's a floor space ratio of 2.2 to 1, and a 22 meter height limit, so essentially 6 stories. So in R3, R4, you can then do 6-story dwellings, 22 meter height limit, and a 2.2 to 1 floor space ratio. And then in R3, R4 zones between 400 and 800. So this is the only difference with the this is the only difference with the residential flat buildings. There's a distance of 400, then a distance of 800 meters. So if it's between 4 to 8, so it's outside of that 400 meters from a local centre. The main difference is there's a 1.5 to 1 floor space ratio, 17.5 height limit, which is essentially 4 stories. So again, it's opening up opportunities to create a high density of housing that's right smack bang within that local centre, and then that extra 400 metres out still opens up an opportunity to do residential flat buildings. The flat buildings are an interesting space, I think, especially being class 2s. There's a lot of it's been a tricky space the last couple of years for people playing in that area. But look, that's a bit of a breakdown. So obviously this has now come into effect. It's now written into the policy. It's now applications as of now can be submitted. DAs can be submitted following this policy. So there's a lot of people looking. Obviously, as an investor and a developer, it's important to always be on the cutting edge, always looking for your edge, always looking for whether this fits within your development strategy of doing these type of projects. So it's very critical and it's very key. And just a couple of stats here. And you may have read this, you may have seen this on the news. It's been quite popular. But essentially, the New South Wales Government estimates the reforms will unlock 112,000 new homes over the next 5 years by making approvals easier, increasing development density and well-connected urban areas. The policy aims to improve housing affordability and supply. So, look, I think the big thing is to read up on this policy. We're going to be putting some links in in the show notes. Read up on it, get yourself familiar with it. Really get to know it back to back. Like, pick your strategy. Your strategy might be doing dual occupancies. Your strategy could be doing 3 townhouses, 4 townhouses. You might want to go down the unit path. The key is to pick your strategy, become good at it, become switched on with it, and look and see if there are what deals are out there. Get to know the maps, get to know the areas. Like I said, be careful of the distances. I saw a site only the other day. A client of ours, I was looking at a site, and it was interesting. Half of their site was in the new mapping, in the state's mapping that outlines the low to mid rise area. Only half of their site was mapped, which I thought was interesting. But like, what we did then is we determined the distance. We worked out the distance from there. In their case, they were close to a train station. That's how it was deemed to be well located, and we had to map it out to see the distance of where they were in comparison to the train station. They were about 500 metres, so it was fine. But look, it's important to check that out. Don't just because it's on the map, you could be 900 metres from that train station. So it's a very interesting space. If we find out more information on that, I'll gladly jump back on the podcast and look into that. But like anything, like when you're doing any type of development, do your due diligence, do your checks. The beauty is these days you can email Planning New South Wales. It might take a few days to hear back, but if you're unsure about something, you want to run your due diligence. You don't want to be paying for a site that you thought could be developed as multi-dwelling and all of a sudden it can't be. It's purely only able to have a house on it because it falls outside of that well-located area. So I hope this episode's been super helpful for you. It's an exciting change that's come into effect. It's an exciting policy that we have the opportunity as investors, developers, people with a passion for doing residential investment to generate wealth. There's opportunities out there. This is an exciting opportunity, one of the most exciting opportunities I believe that has come out for quite a number of years since the Low-Rise Diversity Housing Code. It's important to educate ourselves around it. It's important to familiarise ourselves around it and to use this policy and use this code to generate incredible properties that generate wealth, that enable you to reach your goals, but also have an impact in creating a greater flow of housing to meet our shortages that are currently in effect. So look, thanks for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I want to encourage you, share it around, share it with family, friends, anyone you know that's interested in doing investment and development-based residential projects. Don't forget to tune in next week.